talking to candidates for office from across the country. Today, we're speaking with Representative John Hoadley, who is running to represent Michigan's 6th District in the U.S. House of Representatives. John has served in the Michigan State House since 2015. Welcome to the briefing, John. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's great to be here.
Your opponent, Fred Upton, has served in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1987. Why did you decide to run for Congress this year?
I was 3 when he started serving. I decided to run for Congress because it is clear that we need to put people in community back at the decisions that are being made in Washington, D.C. I've seen it firsthand as a state legislator. This election's really personal to me because of the issues that are going to be on the ballot, and nothing could put that into sharper frame than the potential confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett today. And so we knew that I needed to raise my hand to continue the public service I've already done. But here's the other thing, the choices that are going to be made over the next couple of years by the person sitting in the seat, big issues on healthcare, on the environment, on equality choice, those decisions are going to impact us for decades to come. So it's not just about who's sitting there right now, but the choices that'll impact the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I think that there's a lot of difference between me and the current representative on those issues.
Right. And I'm glad that you mentioned healthcare. I know that's something that you've talked about at length, and it's a very personal issue for you. To start, could you tell us what your position is on Medicare for all?
Yeah. So for me, healthcare is really personal because my partner, Chris, has multiple sclerosis. And I know what it feels like to have to fight with insurance companies to get the healthcare you need. It feels like they have more say over your healthcare than your doctor does or you do. And, what was going through a global health pandemic where millions of Americans lost their health insurance when they needed it the most just shows how messed up and how broken the current healthcare system is. I'm someone that has supported Medicare for all. As a state legislator, I've taken an all of the above approach when it comes to healthcare. So you've seen me on bills that would have a universal system. You've also seen me on bills that would say, let's do $5 copays or, put some caps on insulin. So we're not seeing price gouging on these issues. My biggest approach is that I want to vote for bills today that are going to make healthcare better for our loved ones tomorrow. But I do think Medicare for all, with the components there, whether it's making sure everybody has coverage, whether it's supporting our rural hospitals, whether it's making sure that we're not being price gouged for prescription drugs, or another issue on long-term care, it's something I've done a ton of work on as a state legislator. That's all included. And, I'm glad to see that conversation is moving forward.
And can you, for our viewers who might not know, can you describe what long-term care is and why this is an issue that's so important?
Yeah, so long-term care is a set of care that helps people perform what's called the daily aspects of living. And, this is oftentimes that sort of bridge between someone who needs no help and someone who needs a skilled nursing home, where they really do need a lot of care. But it's this idea that for folks as they age or have some certain chronic conditions, that you could get a little bit of extra help so you can age with dignity in your own home. And this is an area that I think is so important because too many of our families, particularly in rural areas, have watched as the folks who would traditionally provide care, like a loved one or family member, has moved away. And the people that actually do the direct care work, it's a skilled job. It's hard, but they're often paid low wages. Direct care workers are overwhelmingly women of color, immigrant women. They're subject because of a lack of professional standards or support. They oftentimes are getting wages that are barely enough for them to take care of their own family while they're taking care of someone that you love. And, these are a lot of working conditions where they don't have the protections that they should. So this is an area where not only can we do something good to help people improve people's quality of life and health, but we also can do something good for all the people in the caregivers world so they actually can have a little bit more security and benefit for themselves and their families.
Right. Yeah, it's a really good point that you raised. This is truly heroic, difficult, physically demanding, emotionally demanding work. And yet, if you look at what people are paid, it's valued so little. And you mentioned, of course, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And what would a Medicare for All system mean for us right now?
I mean, the simplest thing is that your healthcare wouldn't be tied to your employment. And, as we're looking forward, it is clear that this system uh, jeopardized so many families in the middle of a health pandemic. But it's not just about the ability to have your health insurance, right? We need a robust public health infrastructure. And, I'll note the guy that I'm running against in the piece of legislation he always talks about, the 21st Century Cures Act, actually robbed the Prevention and Public Health Fund $3.5 billion, money that could have helped us be prepared for the pandemic and lessened the burden that so many of us were forced to bear. But he chose to rob those dollars. But here's the other thing. When we talk about separating your employment and your healthcare, it opens up possibilities for so many folks. I was meeting with entrepreneurs in Benton Harbor just a couple of weeks ago, and all of these amazing entrepreneurs had these incredible ideas. They were making their business work where, by the way, because of systemic discrimination, racial-based discrimination, a lot of them have no access to capital, which, by the way, we should fix. But they were all having to work a second gig, right? A job that let them have healthcare. And then their entrepreneurship became a side hustle when it could have been their focus if like healthcare was taken off the table. So they knew that following their passion or innovating on their idea wasn't going to cost them life-saving medication. And so, it's not just about your job, or it's not just about the pandemic, but we're really talking about unlocking opportunity for decades to come.
Absolutely right. And it's funny because it's almost seen as like, I don't know, like a badge of honor, like, oh, I had to work, 3 jobs while I was getting this business off the ground. And it's like, well, no, maybe you could have done it sooner if you hadn't had to have worked.
Right. But this isn't that complicated,
Right.
And every other country has figured this out. And so, and this is one thing when people say healthcare is on the ballot, what we do know is that because of the Supreme Court decision that Amy Coney Barrett is going to hear, that could dismantle the Affordable Care Act, that it's going to be up to Congress to decide what's the system to replace that look like. And that's even more important why we then put people in Congress all across the country that are going to fight for the best healthcare system. So no matter what we end up getting, it actually is going to look closer to what we actually want to see.
Right. That's a really good point. I think especially because people are feeling kind of hopeless at the idea of her confirmation, but you're right, Congress can step in and try to protect people's right to health care. You've already, discussed this is, workers' rights. And of course, across the country and in Michigan, we've seen a steady decline over the past couple decades of union membership. And so as a member of Congress, if you're elected, how can you fight back against the rollback of workers' rights?
Well, I think this speaks to why we need sometimes a generational shift in terms of approaching the challenges that we're facing. And, the issues that people still want to fight from 10 or 20 years ago aren't the same issues that we're facing today. That's why it's important that we're electing folks who know the challenges of working in this economy, who knows what it's like to have gig work, right? That knows the proliferation of 1099 contractors, right? The way that so many of us have picked up side hustles or tried to make it work. And at the same time, we're having less protection than our parents and our grandparents did before. There's a ton that Congress could do, in terms of expanding our ability to fight for workers' rights. Anything from just strengthening our traditional ability to form a union to making sure that we roll back the systematic attacks that have been happening across the country on the right to organize, modernizing the National Labor Review Board to make sure that we could recognize unions faster, recognize the different ways that we have, that we do work today. And, these are all things that just show the need to have a voice for workers at the table hasn't changed. The way that shows up may be slightly different than it was 30 years ago or 60 years ago, but we still need it. And I think we're seeing a generation, I'm 37 years old. So many of my friends enter the workforce where they have a significant amount of student debt. Their first job barely covered the bills and required that college degree. They were put on salary, but taken advantage of because they were then told they weren't going to get overtime. So many different ways that work has changed, and we need to have the laws catch back up to it.
Mm-hmm. And just staying on this topic for a moment, we're obviously living through a global pandemic where one of the most important things that someone can do who's been exposed to COVID-19 or is feeling sick is to stay home, quarantine for possibly 2 weeks. But we do not have a universal right to paid sick time in this country. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've done as a state representative to address this issue for Michigan's workers?
Yeah, I'm so proud to have partnered with then state representative, now state senator Stephanie Chang, who led the fight on these issues. We had an opportunity for years in the legislature to advance reasonable paid sick time, where folks could earn sick time in their current jobs, build a bank, be able to use it in exactly situations like this. But all along the way, Republicans in the legislature fought us on those issues. So people went to the ballot and they gathered the signatures required in Michigan to put something on the ballot. And then ultimately, the Republican-led legislature did adopt an amend strategy where they undercut the will of the people to lessen the protections that we could have had for workers. I mean, look, we've seen that there are folks who are so hostile to having a paid sick time benefit, paid childcare benefits, and other family leave benefits. And we're an outlier in the world. Whether we're talking about maternity and paternity leave or we're talking about paid sick time, we're at the bottom of all those rankings. And I hope folks that are watching this know that this isn't necessarily an everybody is the same on this issue. There are people that are absolutely fighting for these issues in the legislature, but we're up against really powerful forces. We talk about not taking corporate PAC dollars, like a pledge I've made. It's because of the significant corporate influence on so many aspects of legislation, including things like paid sick time. So, you've got to support the people that are running corporate PAC free, that are out there championing family issues, childcare, paid sick leave issues, because we can make a change on these issues, but we got to elect people who are going to fight for them.
Right. And turning now to housing rights, and of course, all of these issues are so interconnected.
Absolutely.
In May, the University of Michigan and Legal Services of South Central Michigan put out a report. And for those of our viewers who are not from Michigan or may not be familiar with this report, it had some really startling statistics. One was that it showed around 40,000 households lost their homes as a result of court-ordered evictions. Now, of course, this number does not begin to capture the agony and trauma that those who are evicted experience. And the pandemic has only exacerbated this housing crisis in Michigan and across the country. So John, can you tell us a little bit about what you've done in Michigan to prevent evictions before and during the pandemic, and also if you support a moratorium on evictions and the cancellation of rent for the duration of the pandemic?
Great. So these are a great set of questions. And let's start by being clear. Most of the action that was taken on a moratorium have just been a delay. So it didn't cancel rent. It didn't say that, didn't take on some of the long-term problems. It just said you weren't going to be evicted this month. Now, that's why I've been proud to, talked about this with Andrew Yang and others about we need to prioritize in the next round of stimulus direct aid to working families and to all of our families, because, being an appropriator, I love helping to build our budget. This is a world where our values can be expressed in where we put our funding. And what we've seen is that we need to have a backstop because so many of our local communities depend on the property tax payments that come from the rent payments and the best way to deal with this is by empowering families with funding so that they can meet their obligations and have the freedom and liberty to spend it on the things that will best help their families. But as a state appropriator, We've also tried to find some backstops. I was able to use and partner with great people like the Michigan People's Campaign, Michigan United, and others to prioritize a rent and eviction diversion program that would help cancel some rent for folks that were paying it. And for those that working with the landlords, that they would come to an agreement with this through some limited available funds, we could pay a portion of the past due rent if the landlord was willing to compromise and cancel a remaining portion. But those are a drop in the bucket. And this is where we need the federal government to stand up and prioritize in this next round of stimulus real American families that are putting money back in the pockets of people who are going to need it most. I cannot believe that they thought $1,200 would then get folks through this. And on top of that, to then see things like talking about cutting unemployment benefits to people who lost their job through no fault of their own. And especially as we see COVID cases spiking now, and we're thinking that, with jobless numbers still going up, we have to be able to make sure that we're taking care of people who need unemployment. All of these things go together. For the 40,000 people who are without a home is tragic. The millions more that are coming across our country because of the lack of action is a travesty, but one that could be prevented if we put people in DC that are actually going to prioritize our families.
And what a lot of housing rights activists have said, across the country is the federal government is not coming to save us, not in its current incarnation. And so they've called on state legislatures, on the governors to come in and enact a blanket moratorium on evictions and to cancel rent, for the duration of the pandemic, in light of the fact that we don't seem to be getting help from the federal government right now. And I just want to make sure I understand: are those policies that you would advocate for on the state level for Michigan?
I am in favor of the moratorium for sure, and I'm glad to see the CDC step up and say some things here as well. But having worked at the state budget, there is a long-term problem here. And so I think, again, we can be foregoing rent, and I'm fully supportive of ways to cover that. The problem, though, is that with so many of our schools funded through property taxes, then what happens next? And this is where all of this comes together, and why the fighting in DC is jeopardizing not just our families right now, because families need to know that they're going to have a safe place to live. Right now, rent will be coming due in a week, right? They need to know that November 1st, they're going to be okay. But at the same time, we also have to make sure then that we're building some long-term trajectory that's helping people out. And, this is one where our governor has done such a great job at putting the health and safety of Michiganders first. And so Governor Whitmer, despite the domestic terrorist kidnapping attempts, despite the grandstanding that came from folks in the legislature on the other side of the aisle, she's been able to put that front and safe first. But we need more tools, and those tools come from the federal government. So it is incumbent upon them to get it right. In the delay that we saw coming out of the Senate Republicans, they've had the HEROES Act since May. Like, there is no reason that we shouldn't have support right now.
And currently, what protections do exist in Michigan? I know it's so confusing. It's state by state. It can be jurisdiction by jurisdiction. What protections currently exist in Michigan against evictions?
So there's a number of our local health counties that have put in emergency pandemic orders. There's additional orders coming, and that have been working with local health agencies across the state. There are current programs that can prevent eviction, such as the one that I helped sponsor through the budget. But the truth is, we're running out of tools, and winter is coming, and it's getting colder. So this is, I will just note, and with the Supreme Court decision that came down recently in Michigan, the Michigan Supreme Court, that invalidated a law, didn't actually say what the governor was doing was wrong. It said that the law that was passed, 70, 80 years ago or whatever was invalid. That is it just speaks to the fact that this is a systemic set of issues that we're going to have to change. I will remind folks that are watching in Michigan, don't forget to vote in the nonpartisan section of your ballot, because we vote on Supreme Court here in Michigan. McCormick and Welch are doing a great job.
And so just to be clear, for me as an outsider to Michigan, there is no blanket moratorium on evictions in Michigan currently.
Except from the ones from the CDC that were handed down. So it is limited. It is based on local jurisdictions. Some are better than others. But there are some resources at the state that can help prevent those evictions. But yeah, this is why we need concrete action.
Well, thank you so much, John. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our audience for watching. This episode will be available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts and wherever you listen to podcasts. The appeal is live again at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and 3 p.m. Central with The Count, a show about what happens after a close election and in the 77-day period between the close of polls on November 3rd and the inauguration on January 20th. Follow Appeal News on Facebook and The Appeal on Twitter for the